Hello, everyone, and welcome to RevolutionTruth's first live streaming panel discussion. My name is Tangerine Bolin. I'm the executive director of this small but global and soon-to-be nonprofit organization. We've got about 15 volunteers from all over the world. We're really grateful to have all of you with us today. This event, just to explain, will happen in about 3 parts. Part 1 will briefly cover lessons from WikiLeaks and the future of whistleblowing. Part 2 will entail law, policy, and civil liberties. We'll then have an 8-minute intermission where we will play 2 videos. One is a brand new video that no one has seen yet. And we will resume with Part 3 after that and a short discussion on the transformation of journalism. And finally, our panelists' thoughts on how to take the Occupy movement forward to engender concrete systemic change. We have a lot to cover today in what is going to end up being a very short time frame. And this panel is meant to be broad. We'll be going over a lot of issues, hopefully with these panelists now and in the near future. So, to start, the person who risked his or her life, to release a massive trove of documents to WikiLeaks has played a key role in shaping a significant course of events in human history. There is an arc that spans from the lies that were told to start a devastating war, to a leaker of documents, to a stateless organization governments could not stop from publishing, to a fruit vendor setting himself on fire and stirring up an Arab Spring, to spontaneous and global occupations. It is dangerous to tell the truth. Bradley Manning, Julian Assange, Michael Moore, Thomas Drake, and lesser-known whistleblowers and others around the world know full well the dangers and harm of being the messenger. In this era of radical truth-telling, we have a controversial and beleaguered but game-changing organization. WikiLeaks has paved a path for future leaking sites. It has sauntered blithely past the blatant failures of some of our most powerful media organizations, and it has imperiously embarrassed multiple governments, all the while bringing up questions of ethics and security and accountability itself. Whatever our feelings about WikiLeaks, what matters at the end of the day is the long-term implications in the overall outcome, not just for this controversial organization, but really for people all over the world. Why does the WikiLeaks saga carry such import? Because WikiLeaks and Bradley Manning, flawed, frail, and human as every person in this situation is, they're symbols, they are signposts of a juncture at which we collectively stand. One path leads further down a road we've been traveling in the U.S., a road of increasing destruction of civil liberties, denial of access to accurate information, aggregation of power and resources into the hands of a very few, and the rise of corporate hegemony. The other path, ill-defined and perhaps difficult to grasp, is one of reclamation. It is reclamation of our basic rights, of justice, democracy, integrity, and decency. It is reclamation of critical thinking, of corporate responsibility and government accountability. It is, in essence, reclamation of ourselves. The U.S. government is behaving terribly, and what the U.S. government does matters, not just here at home for U.S. citizens, but for millions in other countries as well. The WikiLeaks documents provide proof of the abrogation of democracy on an international scale. They evince a cynical disregard for human life and basic human rights. I will posit that millions of people latched onto WikiLeaks last year because we saw them as a tool for a course correction, the promise of some measure of power restored to disempowered people everywhere, not just in authoritarian regimes, but in allegedly democratic nations. It is no wonder, then, that WikiLeaks has evoked such stratified archetypes and intense human emotion. These things matter. 2 days ago, Julian Assange reported that WikiLeaks has been temporarily forced to shut down due to a global financial embargo on the part of PayPal, Visa, and MasterCard. This embargo is also a signpost. It is a toxic power imbalance and the destruction of the bulwark that stood against it. In an arena in which the U.S. Supreme Court has decided that money is speech and corporations are persons with a voice, it is multinational corporations indeed deciding for us what is to be spoken and what is to be silenced. What we hope for out of today's conversation is that together, all of us, through engaged exploration of some of the most critical issues of our times, we can take yet another step in the right direction, that of a future that makes sense, one where only people are people, where speech is indeed free and where telling the truth is welcomed and celebrated. And now, without further ado, a brief introduction of our illustrious panelists today. First, we have Birgitta Jónsdóttir, sorry for slaughtering your name, a member of the Icelandic Parliament and activist who is pioneering a creative legislation to protect and strengthen freedom of information, speech, and expression in modern times. Her Icelandic Modern Media Initiative, also called IMI, is unprecedented. We have Daniel Domscheit-Berg, a network security expert widely known as a former spokesperson of WikiLeaks. He's currently working on the leaking platform OpenLeaks, aiming at a sustainable solution for more transparency. We have Trevor Timm, an activist with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where he specializes as a legal expert in freedom of speech and government transparency. He's also contributing to WL Legal, providing information on legal news regarding WikiLeaks and surrounding issues. We have Arturo Filasto, a developer and security consultant who contributes to the Tor project and is currently working on GlobalLeaks, the very first open source-based whistleblower framework. Kevin Gosztola is a blogger for the dissenter at Firedog Lake who concentrates on civil liberties and digital freedom issues. He's extensively covered the U.S. cable leaks, embassy cable leaks, as well as the Afghan and Iraq war logs, and is currently concentrating on the Occupy movement. Finally, we have Alexa O'Brien. She's a content strategist and information architect. She has worked, amongst others, for the United Nations and many global companies. As a writer, she's also covered the WikiLeaks and furthermore founded U.S. Day of Rage, supporting civil disobedience and nonviolent protest. Welcome, everyone. Thrilled to have you today. We will commence with part one, Lessons from WikiLeaks and the Future of Cyber Whistleblowing. These questions are primarily directed to Daniel, Alexa, and Arturo. Before we start, actually, we want to clear the elephant out of the room. Daniel, as is widely rumored, there are questions about whether you have ever worked for the CIA, Interpol, FBI, or any other national security agency. We thought we would address that straight out the gate and ask you if that is at all the case.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. You know, it's basically one of the few times that ever somebody's asking me about it. Usually people just write about it or relay this stuff. Yeah. So I have not worked with the CIA or any other intelligence agency now or in the past or whatever.
Okay.
The closest collaboration I had with any kind of law enforcement when I was reporting people that were trying to steal a car to the police. So that's as close as it gets. And, you know, in the same way, while we're at it, you know, I haven't stolen or destroyed anybody's software either, because that's being repeated all the time as well. And I have not stolen or destroyed documents from the Bank of America or anything else that is being alleged in that respect. So now that's a couple of elephants that are in the room. But I'm actually quite happy that I get a chance to at least reply to that.
Well, thank you for that. And, you know, I think this is something we can also go into more in depth later. And it's an important discussion I think, for everyone. It's not exactly the discussion we'll be having today, because as we invited all of these panelists, we all discussed a mutual common ground, which was we all have a strong desire to move forward and to learn from this amazing saga and phenomenon of WikiLeaks. So we want to kind of balance these tensions today, and I appreciate you responding to that. I'm sure some of our audience will have questions for you later as well. So first question actually is directed to Alexa. What are some of the most important things that we've learned as a result of WikiLeaks' work?
Well, I would actually say that the things that we've learned are actually really just a reaffirmation of things that have been known about, you know, democratic societies for a very long time. And those are, namely, when the institutions that support democratic principles and democratic governments, those being the press, the civic space, elections, are given to the people, are transparent, that health returns to those particular societies and governments. So the most important thing I think that we've learned from the WikiLeaks example is that solid information and government transparency actually re-energizes civic society, creates informed citizens, and it re-engages people with their government.
That's great. What would you say is one of the primary impacts of WikiLeaks as far as, what is one of the biggest things it's changed, or one of the biggest possibilities it's opened up for us?
Well, I think it's really spoken, through the spin and the PR and the spectacle. I mean, I can only speak about my own nation. What I see in the United States is an ability of people to actually penetrate through the spectacle that has, sort of our civic discourse has turned into, our public discourse about government, about the most important things, has been a spectacle.
Wherever you are, and even for people here in Germany, there now is a concept of positive whistleblowing that has not been as prominent before. And that, I think, is the most important achievement here. And this is what will enable us, hopefully, in the future, to enforce more transparency and to foster civil courage and courageous people to speak out against injustice that they perceive. I think in many places in this world, you don't even have the concept of a whistleblower. You have people denouncing others, you have rats or informers or whatever, but you don't have these good examples of people that are actually exposing injustice and that are thereby being an example for others to follow. And that, I think, is the big game changer here. It has brought this topic on a map where it hasn't been before in that scale.
May I add to this just really quickly?
Please.
I think that what WikiLeaks did was to make whistleblowing an option again. Nobody talked about whistleblowers since Daniel Ellsberg. And also it brought on the agenda, which I think is equally critical, the fact that where the status is of freedom of information, that it is in a dire state and that we have to do something about it. And that, I think, is the biggest achievement of WikiLeaks.
I think that where the Western world, especially my own country, finds itself, it's in a very queer position because it's sort of akin to where former Eastern Bloc dissidents and citizens found themselves before the wall came down. You have a government that uses a language that on some level is not authentic. And I'm not talking about the nuances of diplomacy that happen when people are trying to affect positive change. I'm talking about really simply lies. I mean, right. Guantanamo is a perfect example. I think what ends up happening is there's, this is my own personal opinion. I think that for example, when the Pope went to Poland and spoke in a normal tone of voice in the homily, that act was very powerful for people in the Solidarity movement because most of their officials had been speaking in this sort of party speak. Mm. I think that transparency and the relationships that people have with one another across national divides through the Arab Spring onward have created a kind of authenticity to relationships and to words that have been missing, certainly within my own government's rhetoric.
That's great. So we all know that the last year it's been quite a saga, and this summer in particular with the inadvertent release of Cablegate in an unredacted form. So I want to delve a little bit into that. There are a lot of lessons to be learned from that imbroglio that occurred across multiple parties. Without going too much into the politics or the fight that occurred, I'd like to ask, and really anyone on this call, what do you think is the biggest lesson that we can take forward from what happened and from the unredacted cable release and security issues? What comes to mind as something that we should really think on for paving the way forward for really successful outcomes of protecting whistleblowing organizations, et cetera?
So, regarding Cablegate, I would like to add something that also connects to the previous point. As in what relates to WikiLeaks as a whistleblowing organization. I think that what WikiLeaks has done has been very important in raising awareness and getting people to talk about whistleblowing. However, I would argue that what WikiLeaks has done, especially in the latest cases such as Cablegate, is not actually whistleblowing. Because what whistleblowing is, it's the whistleblower that is aware of some malpractice, of some issue, of something going wrong. Therefore, he decides to speak up in the public interest and denounce that fact, with also some accompanying material or documents that prove his argumentation. What has happened in the case of Cablegate, for example, is not actually whistleblowing. It is simply a public disclosure of certain material that is hidden from the public and crowdsourcing the analysis of these documents to spot some malpractice. It's in the sense the opposite of whistleblowing. It's, here is all of these documents, try and see if there is something wrong inside of them, but not like coming from a genuine interest from the whistleblower of denouncing a particular fact.
Do you think that government transparency in and of itself is a good or bad thing?
I think it is something completely positive. I think that it is a good thing. However, yes.
I think that sort of casts a kind of a negativity towards, you know, the fact that the job of the investigative reporter, which is certainly democratized in the network of social media, is to uncover. And, you know, the traditional role of the press, if you look at the history of the press in the United States, is one that is counter to government. I don't think that is a negative act. In fact, I think that it's actually an integral position for journalists and for, you know, subsequently citizen journalists to look for government malfeasance or corporate malfeasance within documents. But fundamentally, I mean, the idea that we're talking about is not just simply investigative reporting. It's about government transparency.
Yes, that is true. However, there is much more to whistleblowing that goes beyond public disclosure. It is not only the release of confidential material that makes a whistleblower. It's also raising awareness in citizens to speak up when they see something wrong that is happening.
You know,
I believe there still needs to be a lot of work done in that area.
I think that this particular thread strikes at the heart of what is whistleblowing, what is not, and what just happened. And we're still having that conversation. It's an evolving conversation, and it's a dangerous one in some ways. And so I'd like everyone to weigh in on this. Bradley Manning and the chat logs between FBI informant and someone called Bradass87, that actually, Arturo, say, I want the world to know the truth. I mean, when this comes out, it's breathtaking, it's horrifying. I want people to know the truth of what's happening, essentially. So whomever, if that person is actually also the person who leaked this massive trove of documents to WikiLeaks, then they clearly did evince a moral motive, an ethical motive for that action. And I think that this is a conversation that has been tricky for all of us. Was that a whistleblowing act? Was it not? If it wasn't, you know, can we call it treason, or what do we do with this? So let's go.
Yeah. I'd like to have a comment. So I'm here fully with Arturo, and I'm actually quite happy that he raised this point. So to me, this boils a bit down to the question of, is this a pro-whistleblowing thing, or is it an anti-secrecy thing? So what's the direction that you're coming from? But beyond that question that Arturo raised, and this is what you're aiming at now, there's the question of what happens if someone discloses, or let's say gives to somebody else such a big trove of information. Now, if all of that comes out unredacted, then this is different from giving this to people that would actually analyze it. So what Alexa said, I think it's absolutely valid that people are being given this information in order to look through it and then see if anything is in there that should be uncovered. So that's perfectly valid. But on the other hand, it raises a serious concern if that just gets public, because then there is no filter in between. And I think actually, as much as I hate filters and as much as I don't like censorship or whatever, there has to be some mechanism in between that is actually checking if what you do with a disclosure will backfire because you're hurting people that shouldn't be hurt, because you're maybe hurting the whole idea of disclosing information because you're creating some kind of a backlash.
I feel like this...
It's first of all the question of where do you come from what direction, and then how do you make sure that there is at least some kind of a filter in between that makes sure that nothing gets out that is just hurting people. And there are a couple of examples for that. Maybe not even in the Cablegate documents, but there are other publications. So that, I agree, it's very complicated in a world where you want citizen journalists to engage, where you want to have the whole journalistic process more democratized. And that's raising another set of questions. But I guess that's like the area we're hovering around anyways.
Yes, a point of process. But Daniel, Arturo, Alexa, you're all bringing up, I think, some critical points. And I'm realizing as we go that we're going to be jumping around in between our topics, which aren't distinct. So there's no way around that, and that's wonderful. It's fine. So on that line, actually, Kevin and I were recently on the phone talking about some of these ethical questions, and that the line between, there's John Young of Cryptome on one end, an information purist, and then there was the, global denunciation of WikiLeaks having had to release the cables unredacted due to fears of harm to third parties. So in between that, though, in the aftermath of the release of the unredacted cables, we have a report from the AP showing that the New York Times, quote, redacted one of the cables, but the redaction was really for a corporation. So, Kevin, or any of you really, how do we balance that tension between the need for a filter, the very real ethical and moral need for harm minimization to third parties, and the equally real concern over special interest redaction and editorialization?
You call Young a purist, but even a nobody like me, and I really am a nobody, can go through and read through Young's postings of purported emails from Julian Assange to Young, and they're copy pastes out of articles that were published in Counterpunch and pictures from his old blog. So I feel like sort of categorizing him as a purist seems a bit suspect to me.
Well, that's fine. We can drop that. I was trying to illustrate a point about being extremely dedicated to pure source material that has not been touched. So we can leave John Young out of the equation for now, but just that concept.
I mean, it is very complex in that you have this tension between people who no longer trust the media system inside of their country. So since I am an American, I'll speak specifically for the U.S. and not for anybody in any other country. So I can just say here you have the reason why WikiLeaks is so successful is because nobody really thinks that any media organization is going to pursue some of the stories that have been uncovered in the last year. And so you have people that, above all else, are willing to look beyond the fact that some individuals might have been put at risk because they think in the end, it's good for us to actually find out the sort of details that are being disclosed by the release of this information. And at the same time, you've got this sort of crisis of credibility on the part of WikiLeaks. And it's further complex because you have to really struggle to decipher between the situations where you're having an issue and you can say that WikiLeaks is responsible for putting this individual at risk. And then you're also trying to figure out, are those individuals being put at risk because in some way the system broke down and you've got the U.S. government doing something that has somehow made this more complicated? And for example, I would just say that if you look at the AP story about who was put at risk, you'll notice that in talking to individuals who had their names redacted in the cables, they actually wonder why the State Department went ahead and redacted their names. They weren't aware that this was going to actually happen. There's a couple individuals who say this to the AP reporter. And to me, you put a lot of responsibility on WikiLeaks to redact the names, but we also never knew the process for the State Department when they were deciding to redact names. So there's all these complexities, and it's so nuanced, and the reason why there is so much frustration and anxiety and so much energy around people getting emotional is that, nobody knows who's supposed to be doing what, and it just gets more complex.
I think also that in this conversation there seems to be this sort of assumption that WikiLeaks is we don't know what happened with the Guardian situation. The import of this sort of, the direction of our conversation is that WikiLeaks is somehow at fault. That's not to say that the topic in and of itself is not a valid one. Clearly it is.
Actually, but, Alexa, I would like to jump in and just say that may be the perception you're getting. I want to clarify from Revolution Truth that we really see this as there is blame to be found with all parties, and it's a very complicated situation, and much more so than probably all of us will ever know. And so continue, but I want to make that very clear.
There's a lot of unknowns here. The topic that seems more, to the point is that clearly, yes, there is a filtering process needed for making sure that sources are not, or people that are found in source material are not harmed. I would like to add to this the layer of complexity. People say, well, who's going to guard the gatekeeper? Well, I see the gatekeeper as the traditional media. Who's going to guard the sort of cooking of cables that we see? I mean, in some ways, WikiLeaks or the idea of whistleblowing transparency institutions, it's a kind of reformation for the secular age, for the age of information, where the public wants to see whether or not, the legitimate partisan or reasoned arguments within newspapers, within their news sources, is actually accurate.
Yeah, can I jump in really quickly just to put on a little bit of a bigger layer? The reason why we need something like WikiLeaks is the fact that the legal departments within the media organizations are bigger than the investigative journalism departments. The media is in a very fragile state, and at the same time, because of most of the people that are using media are moving online, and the media has not figured out how to make money online in a proper way. So they don't have the resources to fend off all the legal teams that are working globally and abusing the global framework, because information doesn't have any borders. And while we don't have that in place, we have to have something like WikiLeaks, and we have to rely on also citizen journalism, because the media is filtering out so much, and they're often protecting big corporations and corrupt politicians, and it is basically impossible to trust the mainstream media because they can't put out the news that we should have access to based on information that is hidden from us. And it is also important to note that the pyramid, or not the pyramid, the norm for secrecy is shifting and changing, partly because of what WikiLeaks did and the awareness that people have about their right to have access to information that is relevant to their daily life, decision-making in their own countries and in the world on the larger scale. And this is the thing that we really need to, because this discussion is partially about what after WikiLeaks, or how can we use what WikiLeaks did to improve the situation in our world. And I think that we need to apply pressure on governments and media corporations to have transparency as the norm, not the secrecy.
Yeah, going off on that, I think a lot of the blame, even with the redactions, can actually be put on the government itself. And obviously, the New York Times is responsible for the redactions that they make, but the government is in a constant state of just obsessive secrecy. Last year, there was 77 million documents that were classified by the U.S. government. There's 4.2 million people with classified security clearances. And with this many secrets that actually aren't even secret at all, there are going to be massive leaks like this. And then the government is going to then turn around and say, well, no, everything is secret. We see this with the State Department cables, where after they are in a public database, there are Guantanamo lawyers that can't even comment on front-page New York Times stories because they're still technically classified. And then when the New York Times or anybody else asks the government, well, should we redact these things? And if so, what should we redact? The government is going to always overcompensate and try to get as much redactions as possible. And it's up to the media organizations to kind of take this with a grain of salt. I think the problem was that the New York Times was the only one talking to the State Department. WikiLeaks apparently had asked, both during the Afghanistan war logs indirectly, and then I guess during the State Department cable release, and the State Department just said no. So with WikiLeaks using different media organizations, I think that can help, or any other whistleblowing site for that matter, to kind of establish a check and balance system within the media organizations, where if McClatchy had a full set of the cables and New York Times had a full set of the cables, that when the New York Times posted a certain set with a lot of redactions, McClatchy could have gone back and checked to see if there was any corporate interests that were being protected that shouldn't have been in the first place. So I think there's a checks and balance system that can be put in place in the media that could help with that just as much as anything.
So I think this actually helps me wrap up this first part of the panel and help us move on to the next part. But with the closing question on this, again, well, actually, probably first to Daniel and Arturo, and then everyone else can weigh in as well. Complicated question. So, Alexa, you brought up the question of who guards the gatekeepers. That's a question we haven't been able to answer from Aristotle to Plato to Jefferson, Madison, and on, and we're struggling with that, I think, now with the Occupy movement. It's an eternal question. So, and it's a question I think that needed to be asked of WikiLeaks. It needs to be asked of our government. It needs to be asked of the fourth branch, our media organizations. So at the end of the day, who does guard the gatekeepers? How do we ensure those checks and balances? How do we ensure that the media is doing its job, that stateless and maybe rogue organizations like WikiLeaks or other whistleblowing sites, who and what holds them accountable, especially when our states themselves are not being accountable?
So I would like to answer this by saying that what I think is the future of whistleblowing is decentralization, as in the sense that there shouldn't exist one unique power structure as WikiLeaks has been, or as other realities in other countries exist now, but that I can imagine a future where we have various different whistleblowing platforms that are interested only in particular local, regional aspects of the reality. So, for example, I can have my whistleblowing site of only northern Italy, or my whistleblowing site of, for example, every state in the United States. This way, you don't have to rely on one unique point of failure, but the responsibility is split across multiple different actors, and you have at least the possibility to choose, you as a whistleblower. And the credibility of the system depends upon the success of that particular system. And if one fails, you can always go on to another. That is why, for example, we as GlobalLeaks are developing an open source, free-to-use software that anybody can take a look at it, see its code, understand how it works, and there is no question about how is it going to be internally managed, as in the case of WikiLeaks. It's open source, and I think that this is a crucial aspect of future whistleblowing systems, that in a sense they are not at all different than designing security software. Because would you ever use a security software that relies on crypto primitives that are not published? Any competent professional will tell you that it's snake oil cryptography. That's how they call it.
Yeah, I think on the accountability issue, that's almost exactly right. When you only have one organization, it's tough to hold them accountable because there's no other alternative. I think everybody who's in favor of whistleblowing is in favor of a lot of platforms because that just naturally leads to accountability. If one organization isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing, if their security is lax, or you don't like the way they go about their business, you can just move on. Right now, because WikiLeaks was obviously very innovative in this area. And it's only been about a year since they really became well known to many people in the world who wouldn't have normally heard of them. So I think obviously these things take time. Right now, WikiLeaks is on the tip of everybody's tongue, but hopefully within a few years, and including members of this panel, there will be alternatives that people can use, and that those things will work themselves out naturally.
And actually, on that, just to two more questions, and then we'll close this part. But to Daniel. Daniel, what's happening with OpenLeaks? How come you haven't really gotten it off the ground yet, or have you?
Well, we were online for this 5-day test period in August, so this was what we had scheduled in order to make progress in the project, and it was quite successful in a way that we had hoped for. Right now, it takes time, first of all, because we're properly institutionalizing ourselves, and that part is complicated and takes time. And on the other hand, because there is a lot of detail in respect to what we are doing. So a lot of things in respect to how we coordinate with the partners, how we find solutions for some detail you have to look at in this model that we are creating. Working this out takes time, and we want to do it properly. And I mean, other than that, we all have to see that we can, I don't know, sustain ourselves. And we're progressing a little bit slower than we had hoped for, or actually slower than we had hoped for. But I'd like to add one more thing to what was said before. You know, what I think one important part, and this is where we have to look at society, is that we have to measure everything by the same kind of scale. So what I see today is that people do not expect the same thing from one thing as they would expect from something else. So if we have a certain standard of accountability and transparency that we expect as a society, then that should be true for everybody. And I got the feeling that, you know, we're very hyped up about creating more transparency about some institutions, but then less hyped up about transparency on others. And in some way, we're very open to listening to all sorts of weird conspiracy theories right now. We're very open as a society to just being victims of some kind of an information war that's going on, where everybody's just trying to fool everybody else. And this is what I think has to change a bit in the future. People have to always, no matter what it is about, and that goes for OpenLeaks in the same way as for anybody else, people have to ask questions. And they have to just not be satisfied with the most simple answer they can get. They have to dig deeper, and they have to verify what they are being told, and they have to have a much higher standard before they start believing things. And this goes for whatever we are doing in the same way as it goes for what the media is propagating or what the state is telling you. And as long as we're always so satisfied, or many people are so satisfied with the easy answer, I think nothing's really going to change, because we're measuring things with different standards, and that doesn't work.
Alexa, do you have anything to say to that?
I want to just add that this idea of information war is also very, very important for the age that we're in. You know, a lot of times when people talk about the information war, they talk about in the drama and gossip and sort of the gossip rag stuff around whistleblowing sites and WikiLeaks. They forget that the U.S. government actually considers, you know, the civic space in many countries, because of course we're fighting an unlimited, unending war. They consider the civic space to be a theater of war. They draft documents that talk about, you know, they have congressional hearings with Hillary Clinton talking about how we can, you know, how the U.S. government can manipulate Al Jazeera, how, you know, social profiles and social engineering can be used to manipulate opinions on social media. So I think that we need to broaden our understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about information war.
Well, I don't like the word either, you know, but I think it's actually even bigger than this, because it's not just about what governments are doing or whatever. You know, we're developing, as you said, into this information age. And in this age, and we can see that everywhere on the internet already, the currency will be information. This is the most valuable thing you can have. Advantages over others because you have information earlier than they have. More access to information so you can market it or whatever. So all the information in respect to companies or governments or whatever is at the center of this whole struggle. And this is what we have to understand as citizens, I think, is that everybody is just trying to take their own advantage over how they are using information in order to, I don't know, sell us something or make us vote in a certain way or make us behave as consumers or whatever. So, again, we have to be very critical with the kind of information we're getting. And we have to ask for proof. And if we don't get that, we have to ask, why is that?
That's great. So, do we have any parting comments before we move on to our law, policy, and cyber civil liberties first?
I just want to
just address some of these things in that particular panel.
Okay, so actually, Arturo, before we move on, you just set up your first leak node, correct?
We are working on setting it up, but unfortunately we had a bit of delay. However, I would prefer not to refer to it as a leak node,
okay.
Because what we, like as Global Leaks, are interested in doing, although unfortunately we have to stick with our name, is promote whistleblowing, as in the pure sense of the term. So,
and so what do you call
leaking
it?
is only one aspect of whistleblowing. We call it whistleblowing platform. That's
and where did you set that up?
So I have been working for 2 weeks in Serbia for a local Serbian newspaper, and yes, basically we have been writing code for setting this up. It's all open source. You can visit our GitHub page and download it and install it on your own computer. And yeah, so hopefully we are going to do another few sprints of programming in this weekend and the next weekend. And if all goes well, by the end of November, it will be online.
And it's true that you received a grant from, or somehow via second party, a grant from USAID for that?
Yes, it was part of a project that was funded by USAID for developing media in emerging countries. So yes, that is correct.
And that for me helps tie up this portion of the conversation, because it's true. We're on some level dealing with information warfare, whereby it's up to all of us to separate, fact from fiction, opinion from fact, and to ask the hard questions, to work together to get to the truth. I think that our own organization's name it's aptly named because we want a truth revolution. And it's interesting that we've got on this call Arturo Filasto from Global Leaks, that group has just received a grant from USAID, which obviously is not related to our U.S. security agencies, but simultaneously the U.S. government obviously has been coming down quite hard on WikiLeaks. And leading into the next conversation, we have Birgitta here, who is an amazing woman and definitely one of my heroes, living heroes. And she has spearheaded legislation in Iceland to hopefully ensure that Iceland is going to have the strongest freedom of information laws perhaps in the world. She's working with the EU on the possibility of them adopting similar legislation for their member nations. And yet she's on a U.S. no-fly list. Birgitta and Trevor and anyone who else wants to jump in, I want to move this into a conversation about the Patriot Act. Birgitta, you being on the U.S. no-fly list, which is astounding. And also then the implications of Julian Assange potentially being extradited to the United States and successfully tried on a case of espionage. So, Birgitta, what's it like to be on the U.S. no-fly list, and what do you think is going to happen with that, and can you just speak to your thoughts on all that?
Okay, so just to clarify, the State Department or the Department of Justice actually said to the U.S. ambassador to Iceland that I was not under criminal investigation and that I would be free to travel to the United States, then that I would not be a subject of involuntary interrogation. However, at the same time, there was just a leak maybe 2 weeks ago with a document related to me in a grand jury in Virginia. So obviously they were not being perfectly honest when they delivered that message to the Foreign Affairs Ministry in Iceland. the Foreign Affairs Minister and my lawyers in the U.S. from the EFF and the ACLU have advised me not to travel to the States. I want to come, and I am thinking of coming, but I want to come for the right reasons. I want to come to look at ways for people that are interested in freedom of information in the United States to model a legislative package in the U.S. based on the Icelandic Modern Media Initiative. And I think one of the big demands in the Occupy movement should be that the Patriot Act should be removed. Because while you have the Patriot Act in the U.S., you are being occupied from within. And by the people you should be trusting to look after you. And you went from being the country that was heralded throughout the world as a country that had the best freedom of speech amendments and laws to a country that most of us are just in shock, shocked and awed by what you have done to your society. And I think, while you have the Patriot Act, there is not going to be any changes in your society. So I would be happy to come to the States to help those who care for reclaiming your democracy by having stronger freedom of information, expression and speech laws in place. There are many great people in the United States working in this regard, and often for those of us in Europe that look over the Atlantic Ocean towards the United States, we forget how many great people are there and how many brilliant organizations are there to fight for these things and other human rights issues. And sometimes it is as if it's two different nations living in the United States. But I don't really care if I'm on some sort of no-fly zone. I can't travel to China because I have fought for Tibet. I can't travel to Palestine because I was the first parliamentarian to visit the flotilla while I was in Greece after the U.S. boat was taken to dock by gunpoint. So, as long as I'm doing it just feels like I'm doing something right since I'm being so unpopular with certain forces in the world. But it also gives me the privilege to have a pretty good megaphone and to get attention to very important issues. I'm hoping that by upgrading all our laws towards the reality that information doesn't have any borders anymore in our world, I'm hoping that other countries can use that as an example on how they need to upgrade their own laws. And for example, I've spoken to a lot of people in Italy because the situation there is very dire. We are in a very difficult and dangerous situation in our world when it comes to access and freedom of information. So we have to make ourselves aware of it, and we have to put it as a priority. But at the same time, it is critical that we make ourselves aware of the fact that we do not have any civic rights when it comes to protecting our information online. And that is just as important. And then remember to ask me about NATO and the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and the latest policy about cyber attacks later in this panel.
I'll get to that in just a couple minutes. Actually, go ahead. I'll let you go.
I just wanted to remind everybody that it's actually the 10th anniversary today of when George Bush signed the Patriot Act into law.
Oh my gosh.
And
as happy anniversary.
No.
Yes, not happy anniversary at all. And actually later today, I'm going to have a post up on EFF talking about how the Patriot Act was actually never meant to just combat terrorism. And in fact, over the last 10 years, we've seen it's been used overwhelmingly against regular citizens in America, and actually not for fighting terrorism. And I actually can announce right now that the EFF just sued the Justice Department over the Patriot Act because they've been secretly trying to interpret a certain provision of the Patriot Act that basically kind of, well, we're not sure what it does. It's classified right now, but we're suing to find out how the Justice Department is interpreting the law and if it's actually affecting Americans in kind of a broad, privacy invasive way. So that's the news about the Patriot Act. But to go off of what Birgitta was saying about freedom of information and the First Amendment, obviously we have a problem with freedom of information now with so much things being classified, but luckily the First Amendment is still alive and well in this country, and the press has been free to publish classified information for more than 50 years now. We can see it pretty much every week in the New York Times and the Washington Post, even if there was no WikiLeaks or these State Department cables or anything like that. There are leaks all the time, both for the administration and against the administration, and papers have a well-known right to publish this information. And that's the problem with the Espionage Act charges that are being looked at by grand jury right now in Virginia, because if WikiLeaks and Julian Assange ever gets charged with espionage for publishing classified information, which is what every other paper does, the next time in 5 years or 10 years, when something like this comes up again and it's the New York Times that's doing it, they're the ones that are going to pay the real price. The Justice Department right now says, trust us, we're only going after WikiLeaks. This isn't a mainstream news organization investigation. And you know what? They might be telling the truth, but that doesn't matter because in the end, that precedent is going to be on the books, and it's essentially going to allow the White House to say, we can leak classified information as long as it's helpful to us, but anything hurtful, right, we can threaten to prosecute or prosecute. Even the threat of prosecution will stop newspapers from publishing damaging stories because, as we know, newspapers are losing a lot of money, and these legal battles are very expensive. So the WikiLeaks grand jury investigation actually affects mainstream media just as much or more than it does WikiLeaks, and it's a shame there's not as much attention being drawn to that.
I think the First Amendment is in a horrible state in the United States. I mean, look at what happened in Oakland last night. The NYPD, the Oakland Police Department, in conjunction with their arms contractors, will essentially shoot rubber bullets at peaceful citizens who are peaceably assembled, which is our First Amendment right, and they will protect a corporation's right to the First Amendment, but will not protect a human being's right to the First Amendment. If that goes to court, I'm with you, and I'm not saying, and I was talking more in respect to freedom of the press and what you can print and what you can't. I agree that was a horrible situation, but I don't think it was sanctioned by the highest levels of government and has been ruled constitutional by any court. So obviously that's a horrible situation and should never have happened, but I don't think that's consistent with the general principles of the First Amendment. This is an interesting point because, in the nonviolent civil disobedience actions in our legal trainings for Occupy Wall Street prior to September 17th, one of the issues came up was that the city of New York had essentially a fiscalized relationship with civil rights. So a policeman is not really concerned about violating your civil rights because they sort of have an algorithm for how much it will increase their insurance, rates when you sue them and you win the case. This to me is a very, horrible representation of First Amendment rights. Many people who come into contact with law enforcement, whether, with these occupations or in neighborhoods across the United States, they don't have the money to afford a lawyer. Similarly, news organizations oftentimes will, print, corrections or pull stories because they don't have the money to pay for the litigation required to have the highest court defend their First Amendment right.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. That's why I think it's so dangerous to charge Assange because, like I was saying, it's not even the fact that they would prosecute newspapers, just the threat of having to go through that litigation is very expensive and could cause them to spike a story that they would normally print.
So this to me speaks to a sea change that has definitely been happening since George W. Bush, and unfortunately that Obama has simply extended, extending Bush-era constitution weakening, democracy weakening policies and culture. And I think, we're speaking to a massive sea change that affects us on so many fronts, and it's insidious, visible in some ways, really insidious in other ways. And Naomi Wolf, I know, talks about this in her Letters to a Young Patriot and the 10 Steps to Fascism. She talks about self-censorship when we subconsciously start censoring ourselves, as I did, and as many people around me did in the very beginning of our work to support WikiLeaks. People were afraid to talk about WikiLeaks. U.S. citizens were afraid to say they supported WikiLeaks, which is why I started this whole thing. And now, Trevor, you're talking about, newspapers essentially losing even more power in this equation. So what's been baffling me for quite some time, and I think a lot of us, is where are they? Why are they not, whether they like Julian Assange or not, whether they're jealous of WikiLeaks or not, why aren't they coming forward en masse to make sure that the right outcomes occur here?
That's what's really confusing to me. I know the New York Times has been trying to distance themselves from WikiLeaks, saying that they're only a source for them and they're not an actual media organization. But I think it's just so short-sighted. I know that Bill Keller and the New York Times really don't like Julian Assange. And I'm not even just saying no blame anywhere. Even if the New York Times is 100% right about their relationship with Julian Assange, it's very short-sighted and petty to say, well, we don't like this guy, so we're going to not support the First Amendment, or not support it, but not speak out about it. Right. Not speak out about it in the way that they should, because you know what, this might have all gone away at this point if in December, when this started coming out, this news about the grand jury started coming out, if these newspapers all over the country editorialized against this, saying it was one of the greatest threats to the freedom of the press that we've ever seen. If that happened, it would have been in the public eye, and maybe public perception would have taken a different turn, and we wouldn't be sitting here talking about a grand jury indicting a media organization right now. So it's very disappointing.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Birgitta.
Yeah, this is a point that I've been taking during many of my speeches, and I totally agree with Trevor. And I think it is so important that we bring that on the agenda. If WikiLeaks is charged for, espionage, Trevor is absolutely right. That line between for that to then jump onto the traditional media is gone. And it's incredibly short-sighted, and I really challenge all the mainstream media and just all the media in the United States to look a little bit ahead, because they are undoing themselves if they don't just put some attention and focus on what this is doing to your society.
Yeah, and I can actually speak personally, without going into depth, that the personal effects it's had on me and our organization. At the very beginning, when we were in contact directly with Kristen Krasner of WikiLeaks, the first thing he said to me on email was, just so you know, now everything you do, every communication you have is going through the NSA. And so I've had to assume since January that every single thing I do with my little tiny, soon-to-be nonprofit organization of global amazing volunteers, everything we do is probably monitored. I'm used to that now, but why? Why am I used to that now? Why are we living in it? How is it that we're living in an era where people like Trevor and Birgitta and everyone on this call is essentially fighting for First Amendment rights or the equivalent therein in their own countries, and we have to worry about what we say in an email or even in this conversation. I mean, maybe not, but it's a fear. It's a strange fear to have to live with, and I'm not okay with it. And I doubt anyone on this call is.
I have an answer to that question, why this is happening. This is happening because the United States, the government, the branches of power, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches, their power has been usurped by special interests. So we can talk about, the checks and balances that are within the Constitution. We can wax poetic between the left and right. the balance between the executive power, the power to make war, and the legislative power, the power to basically deliberate. But when both are owned by Goldman Sachs, there really is no separation of power. And so that means that all of those powers are essentially in the hands of a concentrated faction. Our founders warned about this, when they basically were essentially arguing for the ratification of the Constitution. And they gave us an option in Article 5 Constitutional Convention for what they called captured government. So the only way to return our institutions, the press, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, the executive branch, is for the American people to essentially regain power within civic and civil society. And it's not going to happen easily. I mean, why is the New York Times concerned about, the Pentagon, appealing to the Pentagon? Because it's a publicly traded company. It has a fiduciary responsibility to profit and not simply to social benefit.
So, Alexa, this actually brings me to a question I didn't have on my list that I think should be talked about. You're talking about regaining power in civic and civil society, and I know that's something, obviously, we're trying to do with Occupy Everywhere, and that's a conversation we'll finish up on later this morning. But Anonymous, I have to bring Anonymous into this equation because, as all of you know, I've been both supportive and a public critic in different ways of Anonymous at different times. And I want to say, when someone from Anonymous hacked HB Gary Federal, the cybersecurity firm that got together with Palantir Technologies and Verico Technologies under the auspices of Bank of America and their law firm, and hatched a plan to attack innocent Americans, people like journalist Glenn Greenwald, Bradley Manning supporter David House. They either broke the law or came right up close to breaking the law, and yet our government is rapidly going after young teenage or 20-something hackers who are, engaged in a movement to reclaim, to re-empower people. Obviously there's a lot more to the Anonymous than that, but can we speak to the hypocrisy of this dual justice system where our government is rapidly going after these young people who exposed this wrongdoing on the part of corporations that work for a law firm, an international law firm. And as far as to my knowledge, there is no actual investigation of HB Gary Federal, Verico, and Palantir. And in fact, Congressman Hank Johnson from Florida has been trying to get an investigation started, and he's been stonewalled to my knowledge. So can we speak to that?
I know that a normal nobody like me who started a Twitter profile, called US Day of Rage, I received credible intel from a federal agent that my organization, like my Twitter profile, was being emailed across, and it belongs to other people now. But at the time, was being, sent to every law enforcement agent in the country, warning that I was high-level anonymous, which is really laughable, because I'm totally not. And secondly, that, they were collecting data on us in order to classify us. I think that, essentially, the moral outrage is certainly justified. I think for me, what becomes really critical is the acts of conscience by normal, everyday citizens and building an infrastructure for spreading information. So you look at the Occupy movement and the way in which Global Revolution and other Twitter profiles, I would include our own, have essentially built trusted networks to pass information along. That becomes really, really important because it's a way to actually inform people and to have discussions with people about what matters most to us as citizens. When you bring your child down to Occupy Wall Street and then you go home and turn on Channel 4 News and find the coverage is completely antithetical to your experience, you start to actually question, what the traditional media is actually reporting.
Yep. So before we take our break, I'd like to ask actually Birgitta about NATO and your parliamentary session on cyber hacking, sorry.
I'm in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and when I took on that task, as a parliamentarian, I think it's the only time the entire parliament in Iceland laughed. They were announcing who was in what committee, because I've never been known to be a big fan of NATO. Anyway, so one of the things I've been trying to do, what I found out and this is one of the things that I really think that people need to be aware of, is that it's important to get people into the machine temporarily, only temporarily, to be that very annoying fly in the tent and to make them aware of that we're everywhere, right? So when, like, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly is like a cozy club of sort of for very I sometimes call it sort of the in-between, when, you know, former foreign affairs ministers and so forth, they don't have any other job to do, so it's sort of a status job. I was really shocked by a report that I saw like maybe 5 months ago, conducted in my committee in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And just to explain to people what the NATO Parliamentary Assembly is, that you have parliamentarians coming together twice a year on the General Assembly from all the NATO countries and Russia now. Originally NATO was created to create a shield against Russia or the Soviet Union. Anyway, so an old lord from the UK House of Lords had created a report on cyber attacks, and this report was shocking because there was so much misinformation, incorrect assumptions in relation to WikiLeaks, Anonymous, and Bradley Manning, and Stuxnet, for example. And with this report, he is calling on all the NATO states to consider a NATO attack, a fifth article attack, which means a NATO ally country is attacked, then you can use full-fledged war machines to go and counterattack. And he actually claimed that NATO has drawn the line where a cyber attack is considered to be like military attack. And I said, okay, where is this line? And he said, that's a secret. And then I couldn't figure out any way to make amendments to this horrifying report. So I sent out a message to my friends on Facebook and Twitter and asked if there are any people that wanted to have a look at each of these 70 articles in this report to create some sort of amendments to them. And then on the last NATO meeting, I went and I said to the guy in front of everybody, and apparently that's never done at the NATO Assembly, that I could not by any means support this report because it was so full of errors. For example, he didn't say that Bradley Manning was alleged. He basically said that Bradley Manning was guilty of all these leaks, and of course Manning has never been charged. And all sorts of assumptions about Julian Assange's motivations in WikiLeaks and Anonymous, and how dangerous Anonymous was, and so forth. And he was so shocked that I said this, that I couldn't support it in front of everybody, that he offered me to make amendments, which I did. I made, I think, 60 amendments to the 70. He accepted 7, the most critical in relation to Manning and WikiLeaks. But to my shock, and this is something why it's important that ordinary people go into the machine to check out how things go. To my shock, he was requesting all members of parliament of the NATO Assembly to urge our governments to accept a NATO policy on cyber crime, cyber attacks, and so forth. None of us have ever seen. And then I started to think, okay, so there are all these NATO policies in place in NATO allied countries, including the United States and any other country that's a part of the NATO alliance, that nobody's ever seen, except a handful. And who accepts this for us? So I'm working on trying to figure that out. I have asked the Foreign Affairs Minister in Iceland to dig it up, and I will ask him in a formal way in the Parliament next week who gets to, why aren't these policies opened up for the parliamentarians, at least in the Foreign Affairs Committee, to see if there is anything in it that we object to. So I just thought I think it's, and I was trying to explain to this guy how easy it is to fake, where a cyber attack originates. It's so easy. And the worrisome thing is that these people, they don't have enough knowledge about what they are doing.
Where can people go to keep tabs on the work you're doing on this front and educate themselves? Because it's such a serious issue. So where might they learn more about what NATO is doing in your work in regards to that?
Okay, so I actually posted a blog while I was at this meeting on a post on this on my blog, which is joyb.blogspot.com. And there is also, I posted the entire document with all the amendments that I did from the notes from three different countries. I got activists from the United States, Australia, and the UK to work with me on this. People I never met, but they made some really important contribution to this. And I think that is one way of doing lawmaking in the future. Instead of having lobbyists, you crowdsource your international work. Or I thought that was an interesting experiment.
We'll be wrapping up here with some questions on the financial embargo of WikiLeaks and moving on into the Occupy movement and then wrapping up with questions from our audience. So first and foremost, something we didn't tackle earlier is this global financial embargo against WikiLeaks. And as I mentioned in my introduction, it's an amazing phenomenon of corporations having great power to limit free speech or define speech. And I'd like to ask all of you about your reactions to thoughts on this financial embargo and what needs to be done about it. So, Trevor, why don't you start?
Sure. I mean, this financial embargo is something that is really unprecedented that we've never seen before, because essentially the government understood at the beginning when these cables started coming out that they couldn't censor WikiLeaks using the law. New York Times versus United States, the Pentagon Papers case, clearly states that the government isn't allowed to issue any sort of prior restraint or censor a paper before it publishes anything. And the Pentagon Papers were classified at a higher classification than anything that WikiLeaks published. They were top secret documents, and the WikiLeaks documents were only secret and below. So they decided to essentially take an extrajudicial or extra-legal approach and sort of informally pressure these companies into doing their bidding. Joe Lieberman was the cheerleader behind all of this. His staff called up Amazon and gently asked them to not host WikiLeaks. And once Amazon did that, Joe Lieberman went on TV and praised Amazon and said how he wishes that all other companies will follow suit. And before you knew it, Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal had done the same thing. And they hadn't even researched the law. They made statements to the press saying that, well, the terms of service were violated and WikiLeaks did something illegal, when we know that WikiLeaks actually didn't do anything illegal at all. They just did what every other paper does, which is publish classified information. There is a silver lining in this, in that it didn't totally work, in that a lot of the internet companies actually did research the law and decided that WikiLeaks was okay. For example, Twitter refused to take them off their service, and obviously Twitter is basically their main platform for getting information out. And Google CEO Eric Schmidt gave an interview where he was asked about this. He said, well, why didn't Google de-index WikiLeaks from its search engine? And Eric Schmidt said, well, we actually, unlike these other companies, went back and researched the law and figured out that they actually did nothing wrong, so we weren't going to take them off. So it's really unfortunate that this is the way things have gone, but it's important to point out that these companies actually are allowed to do this under the law because they have their own First Amendment rights and they're private companies, but it's very unfortunate that they bow to government pressure like this.
So in Julian's announcing just a couple of days ago that they would be forced to shut down WikiLeaks temporarily due to this global financial embargo, he called it illegal. Do you have any idea what he was referring to, or where they might be going with this in a legal sense?
I mean, they might. There might be European laws. I mean, I know they filed that complaint, the antitrust law in Europe. I'm not so familiar with that law. The problem is in the U.S., it would be tough. If they're going to file something in the U.S., I would definitely be interested in seeing their approach. The thing is, there's about to be a bill launched in the House of Representatives this week called Protect IP, which essentially codifies this exact practice for copyright schemes. Essentially, that it says all these private companies can voluntarily shut off services to these websites and kind of starve them out. So we're probably going to see more of this in the future, not less.
Do you see that bill passing? IP Protect?
I am not sure. I mean, we don't even know what form it's going to take right now because they haven't officially announced it. I would imagine that hopefully we can stop them from passing it in its current form. But it is an uphill battle, that's for sure.
Tell me if I'm correct, Trevor. This is how I understand it from I'm on Demand Progress's listserv and sign everything they're doing on this front. As I understand it, and even our own organization, WikiLeaks, RevolutionTruth, any of the Occupy's websites, if you post a video that has music on it that has not been cleared, the entertainment company or the licensor of that music could demand that site be taken down for copyright infringement under the IP Protect Act. Yeah. And there's no way to stop that process or to get your site back up, or at least a lengthy process to fight the giants that be. Is that? Yeah.
I mean, it kind of sounds hyperbolic for me to say this, but it could literally change and really damage the internet. Because instead of, like, the current scheme is that if you have copyright infringing material on your website, they send you a notice and you have to take it down and you can appeal. But all you have to do is take down that certain piece of music. What this law might allow copyright holders to do is essentially censor whole websites over material that might be just a small part of the website. So there are huge free speech implications for this bill that I think hopefully will come to light in the next few weeks when we get to look at its contents and see exactly who's supporting it and what we can do to stop it.
Great. Okay.
I think that this is something that people also don't see. And I think one of the greatest dangers to the Internet as we know it are the copyright issues. And we have to do everything we can to fight. If this sort of bill is going to be passed through the U.S., we are in grave danger of losing our freedoms. Because somebody could actually just post something on, like, there have been some attacks on my Facebook fan page where somebody posts pornography, creates an account in my name, and then posts pornography on my various Facebook sites in order to try to have me shut down. And so in the same way, somebody can post, in your name, it's so easy to make accounts, something to have your Facebook account or your Google account or whatever shut down. But I think when it comes to, just so that I take up the thread in relation to WikiLeaks and the financial blockade, I think people have to understand, no matter what they feel about WikiLeaks or Julian Assange, this is an incredibly serious issue. And just like the issue mentioned earlier in relation to if WikiLeaks is charged for acting as a middleman with the envelope, handing it over to the media, then the media is going to be next. Now, even if people have different opinions about how much money WikiLeaks needs, there is nothing that justifies that these huge corporations that handle so many of our transactions censor what we are allowed to donate to. It's outrageous. And at the same time, if I want to donate to Ku Klux Klan, I can. It doesn't make any sense. So
yeah.
Sorry.
I was just going to say you're absolutely right, and I think it brings up an important point that even if you don't like WikiLeaks, this is just another example of something where even if you're against everything they stand for, this is very vital to protect other people's free speech in the future, that we don't allow these corporations to essentially decide who gets to speak and who doesn't.
It's also about the commons. I mean, this is one of the issues that my country, the United States, has a very difficult time dealing with because of the propaganda and the previous generations' culture war, between the left and the right. When we talk about the commons, we talk about property in the modern era, we're talking about the genes in our body, the air, the very fabric of existence for human beings on the most basic level. And so these kinds of sort of aggressions into or blindsided launches into, outdated, outmoded thinking about property and the commons and how it affects, society, social benefit, are essentially it's creating a system that runs counter to the aims of life.
Exactly.
I have so many questions I want to ask you guys. We need to move on into Occupy, but I want to wrap this part up with one more question, actually, that ties into all of this. Is all really interwoven, at least in my mind. The social cost of anonymity on the Internet versus cyber civil rights and how they might be impinged quite shortly under the IP Protect Act, if that indeed passes in the United States. How do we balance that tension between the need, and I know, Arturo, you can speak strongly on one side of this, the need, very real need and right to privacy and right, in fact, to anonymity, versus also the very real social cost of Internet anonymity and the bad habit that has bred and the way that it impinges our ability to organize effectively and work effectively. Anyone want to speak to that?
Well, what I think I can say on this standpoint is that the real criminals, the people that we should be worried about them being anonymous, will always be able to have anonymity. It's not something that we are able to stop, because technically how the network is, how the Internet is made, it is made to be decentralized and not allow people to be able to control parts of it. So, in a sense, it is important that everybody has anonymity, even the people. Like, if we start enforcing laws that prevent people to be anonymous, for example, this will only go and damage normal people that should be able to have this right, and not people that against whom we are actually worried about protecting, because they will be able to buy anonymity anyways. So I think it would do much more worse than good.
How do we balance that, however, with Evgeny Morozov's book, The Net Delusion? He talks about cyber utopianism and our sort of reflexive assumption that the Internet is automatically a liberating, democratizing force. While it definitely can be, and it needs to be, and we all are working on ensuring that that happens, simultaneously, in many ways it can be used to shut societies down. But there's this other underbelly of it, say on Facebook, and we can actually use WikiLeaks' Facebook page as a really prime example, infiltrated by trolls and plants and sock puppets on a daily, hourly basis from day one. Constantly derailing and devolving the conversation and really destroying a sense of community, a sense of being able to organize, really caused a lot of harm there. How do we balance that?
I'd like to have a comment on that. I think generally, the question is, how do you solve an issue that you have in society? So, I don't know, if people are insulting one another and maybe threatening one another or something like this, then do you think about monitoring all telephone calls to make sure that people are not calling each other up and calling them names on the phone? That wouldn't make any sense. And in the same way, it doesn't make any sense to hide content on the Internet, to censor it or whatever, or to establish systems that will filter or control what people are doing online. Because you cannot solve a social issue using or restricting technology or restricting ways of communication. You can only solve that by making people better. And this is something you have to do in society. So you might have to go into schools, educate kids on why mobbing on the Internet is not something they should be doing, and why it is important actually to stand for the weak people in society and to help them out rather than be bystanders when they are being mobbed, And in the same way, as with anything else, as with all the problems that are being projected on the internet, these are not problems that the internet causes. They are problems that exist in society, and that's where we have to work on them. So this whole, we had this whole discussion about internet censorship here in order to filter child pornographic sites in Germany and in other parts of Europe. And essentially, what you would do, the only thing you would do is trap people in an illusion that a certain problem in society does not exist because they cannot communicate about it and they cannot become involuntary witnesses of something they just stumble across, and then essentially they cannot be courageous citizens acting up on it. And this is what I think we have to aim for. We have to educate people and make people better and not worry about how we can make the internet better, because that's not going to solve anything.
I think that's a fabulous segue into Occupy, because that's happening every day all over the world in these various occupations that have sprung up as a result of being inspired by Occupy Wall Street. So my question to all of you, because we're in the midst of history in the making here. I think everyone on this call and our audience, people all over the world are in the midst of making history. So it's really exciting, it's scary, it's discouraging at times. It's all things at once. But what is Occupy? What is Occupy? Where do we want to see it go? How do we move it forward into engendering change in our nations and change in our systems on a global scale? It's a big set of questions there, but let's just all dive in.
Occupy is a civic square, and that's how I see it. Obviously, Occupy doesn't belong to anyone, and I'm one voice amongst many. With regards to sort of Occupy Wall Street and September 17th, U.S. Day of Rage, which endorsed the call to Occupy Wall Street, and we were responsible for 5 protests across the United States on September 17th. We felt that in order to even approach the corruption in our elections, which feed and corrupt every branch of government, we had to essentially break the casket on civic space. So as the press has been fiscalized and turned into a corporate spectacle of conversation, human beings, American citizens, needed to be able to come into the civic square and relate to one another in an authentic way.
Yeah, I've actually likened it to, in the U.S., as the awakening of the DNA of dissent in our nation. We haven't had national civil unrest on any scale since the 1960s, and I think we've forgotten not only how to protest, but we've forgotten how it feels to stand up together. And I will say that on October 6th, when we followed in your footsteps and had our first march in Portland, Oregon, 7,000 to 10,000 people showed up that day, and they really were from all walks of life, truly representing the 99%. I had goosebumps the entire day. I've never been so proud of my country and my city and people everywhere. It gave me hope, the way WikiLeaks has given me hope, the way Bradley Manning has given me hope. It's a kind of massive truth-telling. As far, in my opinion, this ambiguous, this refusal to be concretized and drilled down into specific demands, which also probably needs to happen. But this ambiguous response to me is a really honest response to incredible complexity and incredibly complex problems. So obviously every Occupy is in a different state in its existence. Portland's having some really interesting issues going on, but also really exciting things going on. What's going to happen? What do you guys think is going to happen with this? What do we want to happen with this? What do we hope for?
Sorry.
Well, if I could jump in here as somebody who's traveling to each of these occupations right now and seeing what people are doing and really trying to bring forward the fact that it's not just people in New York that are doing demonstrating on a daily basis, but it's actually global, that we have, at least under the radar, in my opinion, 500 to 700 locations where you've got at least 10 to 20 people who are going out and they've set up encampments, or if they haven't been able to gain some sort of permanence, they actually are going out there and demonstrating until as late as they can before the police run them out of the park or whatever square they're in, and then they return the next day. And sort of what I'm seeing is that we've already had a level of success to where if this ended tomorrow, it would not have been a failure. I mean, obviously we don't want this to end tomorrow, but they've already reset the conversation in such a way that we have people discussing economic issues in a different sense than before. The whole idea that the people who are rising up are the 99% is an incredible concept that pushes back so much against the whole tax and spend discussion that we were having earlier, to where you've actually got individuals and people who are in power considering the sort of the value of having social welfare in a society and the value of actually having justice and accountability. I mean, it's very fascinating that the people who are out there are actually some of the same people, I think, who get turned on and respond favorably to WikiLeaks, because what these people really want is equal protection under the law. A lot of the people who I met at Occupy Wall Street are talking about the people in the Wall Street financial institutions who enjoy impunity and the way that they have benefited from getting away with committing financial crimes, and that the people who are at the bottom have to be held accountable. You know, if you foreclose, if you can't pay your mortgage, then you end up being, you know, penalized for it. Nobody gets away with not taking care of that. If you have student loan debt, if you've got $100,000 worth of student loan debt, then you've got to do something about it. It's not like somebody's going to come and give you a free pass. And really, that's what this movement has risen up against. And I think that they're really doing a fantastic job of driving this message forward.
Quick point of process. We're at 4 minutes to the end of the hour that we were supposed to be ending, but we had a late start due to some difficulties. I want to ask the permission of our panelists and our producer if it's okay that we go a few minutes over. I know we've got a good-sized audience, and we've definitely got to get to some of their questions. So are you all able to stay for 10 or 15 minutes beyond our original scheduled time?
Yeah, that's good with me.
Like 10 minutes or something like that.
Okay. Thanks, guys. And Birgitta, please.
Yeah, so coming from a country that had sort of a jump start on rising up in relation to the financial meltdown in 2008, where we had pretty clear demands, and we got all of them. Like, you know, we wanted a new government and we wanted a new head of the central bank and so forth. However, we got a new government, and, you know, I, for example, got into parliament, something I'd never dreamed of, because I was just simply not interested. But during times of crisis, you have an incredible opportunity for change. So I welcome crisis. That's the only time you can get real changes done. However, I think it is important, and that's what I've learned since I got into the belly of the beast, is that, and this is something I've been hearing all over during the protests prior to the Occupy protests in Spain and elsewhere, is that people feel the system is no longer serving them. The system has become self-serving and it is too big. And I think it is important to maybe look ahead on, you know, what do we want instead. And I think one of the ways and one of the things we've been experimenting a little bit with with Iceland is more direct democracy, more power, legal power to the people, so that they can both feel that they have the power to change the course if they feel that the people representing them are going off course, or call for national referendums on issues that they feel that they should have a voice in. For example, if they should head into another war or spend all that money on war and the military, for example. Or if they want to spend more money on healthcare, like, you know, of course you have a very special healthcare system. And sorry, I so sick or recently again. So anyway, so I think you know, to be brutally honest, it doesn't matter who you put into the system, what sort of saint put into the system. That person is going to get corrupt because the system is corrupt. So you're going to have to address that, and all of us have to address that and have the courage to demand that we zero a completely corrupt system. It is just so infected with viruses that it is impossible to patch it. And one way of doing it is to create a more direct democracy and to have a look at our constitutions and upgrade them because they're not in tune with the reality we live in today.
This is a very difficult issue in the United States because, in order to get the kind of reform that you need, firstly, there's a tradition of a democratic republic. And so 50% of the population would hear that term direct democracy and feel that it was something that was completely antithetical to the tradition of the United States. I think one of the things I've noticed within the Occupy movements, it's really not being talked about very much in the media, is there certainly is a list of grievances, clearly that is sort of developed over the course of different occupations, but there's also a tremendous amount of creativity that's being unleashed. And, yes. I think that what Birgitta's talking about is important. Perhaps the United States will never become a direct democracy. But, however, there are methods and tools that are being developed, like on Occupy Dev mailing lists, for example, or within working groups at different assemblies, to approach different institutional reforms or parallel structures like a wiki to, uncover what the main grievances are. At US Day of Rage, we had one specific demand. We're one voice amongst many, and that is electoral reform. Not as an abstraction, but because our elections are so corrupt, they corrupt every branch and power of government. If you clean up the U.S. elections, meaning getting special interest campaign funding out of these elections, you essentially free up those institutions to have, free and fair elections remedy myriad ills and abuses of a government that preys on the resources and spirits of citizens. But, of course, that's a process. In many respects, the civic space that is, Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Portland, etc., much like the Internet, is a place where people meet, they take ideas, they go back to their communities, or take independent action, and try to mobilize affinity around those issues.
So I want to jump in here and just say I've been really fascinated by our founding fathers for quite some time and how they debated and fought and argued and got into crazy discussions over how to found this country and really what was at one time one of the greatest nations as far as our rights and freedoms. One thing that Madison fought against, ironically, was majority tyranny. He really worried about majority tyranny, which was ironic because obviously they came from the king, and so they should have been worried about minority tyranny, perhaps. But he was really worried about mob democracy, and there are lots of interesting dynamics happening and lots of paradoxical questions coming up, not only as a result of WikiLeaks work, but as a result of Occupies everywhere. And one thing Madison did in one of his most brilliant moments was, in his worry about majority tyranny, he came up with what was called the extension of the sphere. And some of you on this call may be familiar with this. It's kind of buried in the Federalist Papers. But the extension of the sphere was the idea that when you have a plurality as long as you have a plurality of interests, you have so many interests multiplying, you can never get a mob coming at you to overthrow your small aristocratic government. And so he devised ways to ensure a plurality of interests, which has its pros and cons. And I've always seen this, globalization, how divided we are, how disconnected via the internet, etc., as sort of this radical electronic extension of the sphere, of Madison's sphere. However, Occupy has made me start thinking, my goodness, social media is shrinking the sphere. We may be anonymous, we may be disconnected, Facebook friends aren't necessarily real friends, but we've used social media, contrary to Evgeny Morozov's concerns about this, as a way to start occupying this planet, occupying our civic spaces. So I guess my question is, how then do we take this further? Because every community working on this is embroiled in its own issues and it's the strategy itself of occupying. How do we start connecting with all the other occupations? How do we, with this sense of leaderlessness, which also has pros and cons, how do we connect and be effective and efficient and really engender change together?
It's happening. It's happening organically too. We have to be very dangerous. We have to be very careful here because just like in times of crisis, there are also risks involved, right? But we can sit around and strategize what everyone should do, and then, it's not very fun to herd cats, And the Occupy movement is a herd of cats. And there are certainly dangers to, even right now, tonight at Occupy Wall Street, they're trying to set up a spokes council. And a lot of people feel like the spokes council, which places caucuses ahead of thematic groups, essentially is the same old model for the same old stuff. So, there's a lot of things. I'm sure many people will make mistakes. To me, it's much more fundamental. I mean, I take a very Havelian approach. As an individual, it is my responsibility, I believe, to engage. And because I don't have children, I'm able to take risks that perhaps parents are not able to take in my country, where it's my responsibility to act out of my own conscience, and hope that that act of authenticity, is cumulatively multiple acts of authenticity across a population of citizens and other peoples will create the kind of movement we need within our institutions. And we need to reform and rebuild those institutions, and the civic space is one of them, the press is the other. It's just like WikiLeaks, as an institution that buffers the press or other whistleblowing sites. Fundamentally, when those institutions start to straighten themselves out, there is a natural, inevitable cause and effect with a citizenry.
Well said. And just a remark before we actually start taking our audience's questions. Wanted to throw out there, just so that all of you know and our audience knows as well, we're talking about, and this, again, we're just one tiny part of this massive whole, but we're talking about doing Occupy Black Friday. And what we hope for, we're talking about what we've lost, what humanity has lost in the last long while, but definitely in the last 11 years. If you go with the higher numbers, the 1.4 million Iraqi citizens that have been killed in this atrocious war, all the crimes that have been committed in both of these wars, the financial system on the brink, I mean, the losses of homes, the suffering worldwide. I mean, we all know what a dire state humanity is in and how hard we are all working all over the world to change this with great hope and great dedication to this. And what Americans, I think, have a hard time doing is mourning. As you all know, we were told to go shopping after 9/11 rather than have a day of mourning. And we're tossing around an idea here in Portland about doing a Black Friday silent march and asking people all over the world to do Black Friday silent marches, successively. So that's something that's to be continued, but I want to throw that out there on this call. It would be a beautiful thing to try to get as many people, millions out, in solidarity to just have a moment of mourning for what we've been through as a species, that our phenomenal frailties and failures and yet our undying spirit and hope for our futures. We have a lot to hope for. We have a lot to worry about, but we have a lot to hope for. And I'd like to feel for a moment that, standing in solidarity with millions all over the world, that we can walk together over this thing. So that's an idea. We'll see what happens. But do we have any comments or questions or anything from our panelists before we actually turn this over to taking or my gathering questions from our audience? Any last
Well, I just want to stress and remind all of us, and I think I've been very happy with this panel, that we're running out of planet and we don't have a lot of time, so we have to organize ourselves. And we have to remember that each and every one of us are responsible for creating our own societies. And if we want to live in the dream society, our dream society, we have to go out there and take part in creating that.
Yes. Hear, hear. Absolutely. And I know Birgitta, I know Alexa, I know everyone on this call, and our audience as well. We are dedicating our lives to this. And I just really want to send out a huge shout out to everyone here and everyone listening, because seriously, it's hard work. It's exhausting, but we're all doing it. And I can't tell all of you enough how thankful I am, for you, how, our organization is for you. Thanks everyone for everything you do every day, because it does make a difference. Okay, so taking some questions for our panelists, and Birgitta, if you need to leave at any moment, you're free to do so, and just a quick thank you to you as well for being here. It's such a pleasure always to talk to you, in case you have to leave. Okay, so, all right. Do people think, from Red Jade, I'm not sure if it's Twitter or Facebook, but do people think it is the intention of the U.S. to force an extradition, the extradition of Assange to the United States via Sweden? Do we think that that's the U.S. government's intention?
can I answer that? Because I have a little bit of insight into this. Because obviously they're very desperate since they've gone after me because and other WikiLeaks volunteers like Rob Konkureb and Jacob Appelbaum. So I think, and all the people that volunteered on the collateral murder video that are based in the U.S. Have been summoned for the grand jury, which is to the rest of us who live in sort of democracies, we are astonished that this thing exists, and I have never had such a Kafkan sort of realization as when I hear about all these different secret documents associated to WikiLeaks and to me in this legal thing. I think it is extremely important that we are on our alert, and I think that, you know, in relation to attempts by U.S. government to have Julian extradited either from Sweden or the UK. Let's remember that both countries are very pro-USA when it comes to that sort of issues. I think he is in just as much danger in the in the UK as he is in Sweden. I think it is important that his own government shows, like the Australian government, shows him the support and the shield that he needs. I have, for example, gotten an unconditional support from my own, from the government in Iceland. And I would very much like to see both the Dutch rally behind Rob and the Australian government rally behind Julian Assange. And if not, I am sure that there are some countries, if he calls for some sort of shield from other countries, I'm sure there are other countries willing to step in and shield him from being extradited to the United States, because you do have very, very, very grotesque legal system when it comes to terrorist acts. And let's not forget all the jargon that we've been hearing from, in particular, the right-wing politicians in the United States calling WikiLeaks and Julian Assange terrorist organization. So it is a serious matter, and we need to keep our eyes and ears open and be ready to help if needed.
We do. We were actually hoping at Revolution Truth that we could get at least 1 million signatures on our letter to the U.S. government. I mean, obviously, we don't have tens of thousands of dollars to really plug this and get it out there, but we're still hoping that more people will sign, because it is a letter defending WikiLeaks, and it, you know, we need that to go public so that we can, you know, really alert the world to the seriousness of this. So, Birgitta, actually, one more question directed to you. What is the current state of the relationship between the U.S. and Iceland? And if IMI does, in fact, become legislation in 2012, how do you think that this will affect the relationship between the two nations?
Well, I think that we have a sort of a relatively good relationship. However, the Icelandic Foreign Affairs Minister has not bowed down to the demands from the U.S. Government to various different issues. And has sort of stood firm in relation to things that he feels is important. So it's usually we've had like a conservative government in a long time in Iceland, and the conservatives have been, you know, of course, responsible of having the massive financial meltdown in Iceland that caused us to have the third largest financial meltdown in the history of humankind. They always used to bow quite deeply down to the U.S. Requests, as one can see from the cables. So I'm not worried about IMI. I actually requested a meeting with the U.S. ambassador and had a very good discussion with him about IMI and why it's important, and just to have him understand that this indeed did not have anything to do with making the live WikiLeaks easier. That was never actually the intention, because WikiLeaks had already at the time figured out where all the best legislation was in order to keep information up. We want to make sure that others could have access to that sort of legislative framework without having to go and scan the world over, and have the same opportunities to have information available to those that should have access to it.
Kind of want to move to Iceland.
How is the U.S. government towards, like, is the U.S. government this is something I've never really been clear on. Are they going after every single former WikiLeaks employee, or are they just singling out a few?
It seems that they have, if you look at the people on the sort of, because we would never have known that they were going after our personal information and our IP numbers if Twitter had not fought for us and actually had our back in this to unseal a secret document requesting them to hand this over without our knowledge. So if you look at the names, it looks like it's people that were involved in relation to collateral murder, and the video that was released in April 2010. So, but it's hard to say. I don't. Everybody that I know that were associated, that had accounts, have been targeted, except the journalists, for example. And I don't think that Daniel had a Twitter account. But
in fact, I did, but that's obviously, as has been alleged, just a sign that I'm part of a CIA program, and that's why they're not going after me. I don't know.
Yeah, but it looks like they're going specifically after the collateral murder.
I'm the credits, so I don't get it myself,
Why they haven't subpoenaed you, Daniel?
Not that I'm aware of, but then again, I'm not really following this whole story so closely either, so I wouldn't know how. Twitter hasn't contacted me, and my profile is really, I've not been using this. I haven't used it in like more than 1.5 years or something like this, I think. And it's a private profile that I used for a couple of months. So maybe it wasn't just anyhow interesting. So I have no idea.
And then people around Bradley Manning, of course, like David House has been subpoenaed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
But there is another element which I find to be interesting, and there are more, I think there are like 3 other companies that the government is refusing to release the information about who are these companies that were on the same list that the Department of Justice was requesting information from them. So one doesn't have to speculate for a long time to come up with which ones they are. But this whole thing is just so absolutely bizarre. And I think that actually I have to say I'm very thankful that they went after me, because it raised my awareness about the gravity of the situation when it comes to our online content.
Wow. So
having covered Guantanamo, intimately, and obviously not publishing everything that you learn in the process, I know that certainly the right wing in the United States came out and called for extrajudicial murder and assassination. But it's not that Obama's the left, but it's Obama's basically Department of Justice, which is sort of pretending to be one thing and doing the other, and they have gone rabidly. The U.S. government has gone rabidly against defense lawyers at Guantanamo. They have a sociopathic need to keep the lid on and control of the information space, because it's like anything. The minute one bit of truth comes out, the whole house of deceit falls apart.
Yep. Which we hope to help make happen in all the right ways as time goes on. And thank you to WikiLeaks for really kicking this up so many notches. We've got a question directed toward, I guess, Arturo and Daniel, really. How should WikiLeaks and other whistleblowing sites, or how can they, prevent USG and intelligence agencies from interfering with operations?
Oh, that's a pretty big one, So I think generally you cannot really prevent that other than making sure that the people you're working with, these people, or you have a reason to trust them. So from our perspective, we're working with a very small team. I can vouch for the people I'm working with, and we have a couple of mechanisms in place to make sure that people cannot just join whatever it is that we're doing, without some scrutiny in the process. So I think that's the only thing you can do. And on the other hand, I think it's quite important not to be too paranoid about this either, because if you get too paranoid about these kind of issues, you won't be able to do anything at all. So I think the bigger thing is that you have to keep in mind that you design a system that has checks and balances in place that does not allow even malicious people to manipulate the system or to, I don't know, to sniff on leakers within the system or anything like this. And this is what we are taking into account with our whole development process as well.
Well, from our standpoint, we have no worries of this kind because we are only developing a software. We will actually never run the software on our own machines. So our goal is simply to make the software as secure and as possible. Then it will be made open source, so people will be able. It is already open source, so you can go and look and see if there is a NSA backdoor inside of it, or if you know, the material that gets submitted through WikiLeaks gets sent secretly to the CIA. But we're completely transparent and in the open through all of our development cycle. So anybody can start from now looking at what we are doing and be sure that there is no Secret Service hands on it. I would like to add also that actually what they are saying is what should we do to prevent whistleblowing sites to be interfered by Secret Service? Well, Secret Service actually runs their own whistleblowing sites. So, I mean, we shouldn't only think of whistleblowing as something that is regards only media and releasing super secret leaks. Whistleblowing is a much wider world that interests also other people that are not interested in disclosing this information only to media. So it's also important to sort of figure out what the correct balance is. For example, if I want to set up a whistleblowing site for IRS, I'm not interested in Secret Service interference because in that case, obviously, I am the government who is setting up a whistleblowing site to collect information on tax evasion. So it's perfectly reasonable to not worry about that.
That's great. Let's see. Do any of you believe that the alleged actions of Bradley Manning relate directly in some sense to the OWS movement? And if so, how? Tough question.
Well, just based on the fact that when I was down at Occupy Wall Street, I saw somebody who was standing there with a Free Bradley Manning sign and actually almost looked like Bradley Manning. I can say that it speaks to the same sort of feeling of injustice. Like I assume that, you know, if Bradley Manning in fact did release the documents to WikiLeaks, that he, in some level, was looking and felt like there was some level of injustice going on. And I think that the people who are out at Occupy Wall Street have that same sense of thinking that there is injustice going on. So that's basic. I mean, there's really, I don't feel like extending it further because I don't know anything more, but if I had to say, that's what it is.
Okay. Alexa, do you have anything to say to that? I know you followed that case closely.
I would just say that, you know, certainly I don't know Bradley Manning, and I don't know if he was the whistleblower behind, you know, the WikiLeaks releases. But certainly the idea of the ordinary person, the ordinary citizen sort of within the institutions taking a, you know, courageous act, and of course his act was far more courageous than really anything I've seen, you know, whoever did it. There is something very symbolic about that for the modern age, the internet age.
Okay. What would all of you like to see as a result of the Occupy movement, and what would be the point at which you say, okay, we can stop occupying?
This is a question, you know, I get asked quite a bit, sort of like, where do you want it to go? You know, to me, it has to come back to even a much more granular level, which is, as a citizen myself, what can I do today that, you know, is an act of simple, ordinary honesty in my own life, in my own society? That has a cumulative effect. I mean, I'm not really somebody who believes in, like, erecting some well-intentioned flag for many to die under. I believe in revitalizing the citizenry, of creating a space where Americans can engage in politics, restoring our institutions, and then letting human beings do what they do naturally, which is to create societies. and to act in their self-interest?
It's a valid question, but I think that you want to see this keep going. Like, I don't really want to say where I think the end point will be, because I don't want to impose that sort of constraint on that on the movement, both editorially and then also as a citizen of the United States, because I think that one thing that makes the Occupy movement so powerful right now is that it does have people trying to guess and figure out where it is going to go. And, one of the critical things for the movement is to decide when they're going to begin to compromise, when they're going to maybe sit down at the table and bargain with power, if they are going to bargain with power at any point. And, also, at what point are you going to get involved in electoral politics? I think that in Wisconsin, the uprising there got involved too early. And that is really why you've got some struggle with actually having any sort of an occupation in Madison, Wisconsin. And so I just, I like the idea that we don't know where this is going. I think that's really empowering, and I don't see why this has to end at any point, because dissent is critical to the health of a democratic society.
And conversely, do you have any concerns that this could fizzle out or be stopped somehow?
Well, I just think that the people have been so awoken that they're not going to go back. And that the tactic of occupying has become such an infectious thing for people that you see individuals wanting to go occupy space and actually struggle and really take on the climate for dissent in their community in such a way where they actually believe they have a right to carve out a space where they can continue a political conversation 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
I see this as something very similar to like the spring, the Velvet Revolution, but even before that, the Czech Spring. It certainly could fizzle out. I mean, if the U.S. government or local law enforcement bring out, the tanks and the riot police and act in a violent fashion towards the populace, yes. I mean, it certainly can be crushed. And we are not the exception to, the rule. These are ancient problems of governance. I think, however, the Czech Spring actually did get wiped out by, the regime in Czechoslovakia prior to, the wall coming down, blah, blah, blah. I think, however, that, in many ways it's similar. Like, Czechs had like underground libraries and underground theater. Similarly, you have these parallel structures being built in the civic square. So once again, it comes down to, individuals' free will and choice to act in a courageous and truthful manner, and building structures that allow for some kind of authenticity in the face of the state's the system that runs counter to the aims of life.
I think that's an excellent point on which to conclude our first live streaming panel discussion with all of you today, unless any of you have anything you'd like to add before we close. Well, I want to thank all of you for being here today. It's such a pleasure to be getting to know each one of you, to have had you here with us. It's an honor for Revolution Truth, and I'm sure for our listeners as well. I hope that this is a to-be-continued conversation. We're planning on launching a live streaming series of panel discussions, eventually with video. So thrilled to have you, and thrilled about the work that every single one of you is doing. Also want to give a shout-out and huge thanks to WikiLeaks. I know that this is probably an interesting panel, if they're paying attention today, for us to be hosting. And I just want to say, WikiLeaks, obviously you've changed the world, and millions of people are grateful for that. We are going to continue defending and protecting your right to exist, and protecting Julian Assange in any way we can from being extradited to the United States. We hope that we can galvanize a lot of people to get really serious about this and the serious implications of this situation. So thanks to everyone. Thank you to WikiLeaks, and to all our future whistleblowing platforms that are being developed. I hope to have a more in-depth conversation with you, Daniel, and Arturo on a whistleblowing platform panel upcoming. So we'll talk about that later. And thanks to all our Revolution Truth team volunteers and Christopher Sisk for producing this today. Thanks, you guys. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao.